All right, hello everybody. How are you doing? My name is Alan, and it's that time again. So let's talk some metal. Today, I'm going to be covering a topic that's always been a popular one for folks to sort of theorize about, and it gets discussed a lot online and when people are just, hanging out. It's the question of what happened to thrash metal, in the early 90s, that you had all these excellent bands, like featured on the picture here in the background. And then it seems like very rapidly they all kind of disappeared, and thrash just was no longer a thing. And something that's people bring up pretty often is the idea that grunge was the culprit. That if this is the murder mystery, grunge killed thrash in the basement with the lead pipe or whatever. And I have kind of a different take on what killed thrash metal. Grunge certainly didn't help matters any, but I don't think it's the main cause. I don't think it's really the culprit. If you're holding grunge responsible for the death of thrash, I think you've got the wrong person. And so I want to kind of make an argument that other things were responsible and that grunge played a smaller role than what some people normally propose it did. All right. And yes, I want to point out here at the beginning, sure, thrash metal is alive and well today. There have been thrash bands that, kept the flag the flag flying the whole time through the 90s and 2000s. So thrash has done its thing, but it definitely went through a big downturn in the 1990s. These were my formative years. I was very much into heavy metal at the time. It was my late teens, so I kind of lived through growing up cutting my teeth on thrash and then seeing it just completely disappeared from the metal landscape for a while. So again, a lot of people point to grunge as the culprit, that once grunge started to break big, that thrash metal quickly disappeared. And I get why that is, because the timeline of events is very suspicious. The two sort of mega breakout albums for grunge are, of course, Pearl Jam's 10 and Nirvana's Nevermind. They were both released in fall of 1991. And when you got into 1992, there was very little new thrash metal to be seen on the landscape. I've looked around and I could only really identify two big name thrash albums that came out in 1992. There's Testaments to the Ritual, which got kind of mixed reviews at the time, and Megadeth's Countdown to Extinction, which of course is its own little can of worms we'll come back to in a little while. So it really does seem like, yeah, once Nirvana and Pearl Jam were getting a lot of attention, that where were all the thrash bands? All of a sudden, they seem to be completely missing in action. However, I think something that's really important to remember here is that when grunge started to explode there in late 91, grunge went mainstream very quickly. And as such, it wasn't going into the underground. Sure, metal fans were aware of it. Bands like Nirvana got a lot of repeat play on things like Headbangers Ball around that time frame. So metalheads were listening to it. Some of them liked it, some of them didn't. But grunge was rapidly being marketed as the next big thing for top 40 music. It was radio music. It was being packaged and sold in a commercial sense. And thrash metal was never really that. Sure, you had a couple of, the big four bands that were on major labels and could sell lots of records. But even among those, nobody was really expecting, Slayer songs to appear on FM radio. Nobody was looking at those albums as being the next big thing that all teeny boppers were going to be into. They were big, they had a following, they would sell a lot, but they weren't going to be producing, chart-topping hit singles for you. That was never the point of thrash, even amongst the biggest bands at their peak, save, Metallica. So grunge wasn't going into the underground necessarily and trying to take over that scene. Grunge was being driven towards, that, commercial front. So it was being marketed towards a different audience primarily. The labels that were really pushing grunge to the next level, they weren't wanting them to be the next Testament. They didn't want Pearl Jam to become the next Slayer. They wanted them to become the next Def Leppard and those kind of things. So what grunge did, in my opinion, and again, this is all just my opinion. It's for fun. I've got facts to back it up, but it's just my opinion at the end. Grunge didn't kill thrash. Grunge killed glam metal, the hair metal that had been popular in the late 80s. This was the stuff that had been producing the top 40 hits and was in all the magazines that you would buy at the grocery store and marketed to teeny boppers. These were the bands that suffered when grunge came out. And you don't have to look far down the list of big name bands and how they fared after 10 and Nevermind came out to see the effects. Def Leppard was one of the first mega hair bands to get an album out after grunge started to break. Yeah, Adrenalize came out in 1992, and sure, it went to the top of the charts, but in terms of hit singles, it didn't do nearly as well as its predecessors. I don't think it produced even one top 10 single on the Billboard Top 100. Their previous album, Hysteria, had something like 4 top 10 singles. They had a number 1 hit, a number 2 hit. The album was huge. Adrenalize sold well, but the singles didn't come. They didn't materialize. They played Let's Get Rocked until everybody was sick of it on MTV. And some other songs did okay as singles, but yeah, it didn't have the same impact as Def Leppard's past couple of albums had. When Poison released Native Tongue in 1993, nobody really cared. They had one single that made it to number 50 on the Billboard Top 100. This was a huge band just a few years earlier when they had released albums in the late 80s and early 90s. Yeah, they'd have multiple hit singles. By 93, they couldn't squeeze a single one out of the album. Motley Crue's self-titled 1994 album suffered the same fate. Now, another thing, yes, these bands were going through lineup turmoil as well, which wasn't helping matters at all. But yeah, this was the stuff that had been on the radio, and this was the stuff that had been in the top 40 singles. And that's where grunge was now parked, and there wasn't room for these bands anymore. One other one worth noting that, Guns N' Roses kind of became a non-entity after the whole Use Your Illusions double album had cycled through and they had toured for that. By 1993, you were getting, the Spaghetti Incident, random cover songs, which, okay, this is kind of fun. You guys want to make another album? What's that? Check back in 2 decades? Okay, I think this has run its course then. Last point to kind of help hammer this home and make my case is what you saw were these big glam metal bands quickly died and disappeared for the landscape. Sure, they would come back later, but it'd be years later when they would kind of get onto the retro, let's get the band back together and play to all our old fans who are now soccer moms because it's been 20 years. In the meantime, the big thrash bands didn't evaporate. You didn't see, Testament and Overkill and Anthrax break up and quit making albums. They persisted. They were still there making albums. So again, I think if you're looking for grunge to be guilty of killing something, I think it's glam metal that they had the biggest impact on, more so than thrash. But thrash did go through a significant downturn, and if grunge wasn't the main thing affecting thrash, what was? I think we got to look at some other factors. I'm going to lay out 3 things that I think had a bigger impact than just grunge showing up. The first thing is that heavy metal changed very rapidly in the first few years of the 1990s. For one thing, 2 of your biggest bands in the world kind of, they didn't break up, but they fell apart and had to be rebuilt in different ways. Rob Halford left Judas Priest in 1992. Bruce Dickinson followed suit about a year later and left the ranks of Iron Maiden. And all of a sudden, 2 of the bands that could sell out arenas night after night after night anywhere in the world were in uncharted territory. And it took them a while to get new singers, and those albums didn't do as much. The 800-pound gorilla in the room, of course, is what the big two bands had done with Metallica and Megadeth. Metallica's Black Album came out right there in that same time frame of late 91 that 10 and Nevermind had come out in. And that album had a significant impact on real heavy metal. Again, I was in high school at the time. I cannot tell you how people were so excited for that Metallica album to come out. The video for Enter Sandman had been in heavy rotation for weeks. People were foaming at the mouth wanting to buy that album, myself included. Again, I grew up in a rural area. It was an hour drive to get to a decent record store. I was there the weekend that record came out, bought the cassette copy, got home, sat down, put on the headphones, really just, literally vibrating with excitement, ready to hear it. I fell asleep before side A finished. I woke up the next morning with the headphones still on. It's like, what happened? Look at the tape deck. It's like, I don't think I even made it to the end of side A. Oh, that ain't a good sign. It was a very different type of album, and Metallica was the biggest band in heavy metal. What they did was going to steer heavy metal in a different direction. And of course, whatever Metallica did, Dave Mustaine was going to try to do better. Countdown to Extinction came out in 92, and Megadeth was changing their sound and also moving away from the technical thrash they had perfected on Rust in Peace just a couple of years earlier. These weren't the only things. It wasn't just the established bands doing weird things. The big releases in 1992 were from bands with different sounds. You had Pantera with Vulgar Display of Power that came out in February of 92, and of course was a huge hit right off the bat and really established them. Cowboys from Hell had got them on the map, and Vulgar Display cemented them as a force moving forward. White Zombie released their big breakthrough album. Biohazard came out at the end of the year, and that album got an insane amount of airplay on MTV and such. If you can't tell, I am not a fan of Biohazard. Of all these albums, that was the one I liked the least. And these bands, they were heavy, but they weren't really thrash bands. They were kind of a different breed of heavy metal. Metal was changing a lot, so thrash, in the meantime, kind of got changed around as well. If you look at what bands were doing prior to that late 91, 92 window, and what they started doing in 93 and 94, yeah, they were changing direction. Some examples here. Testament's The Ritual came out in early 92, so it still had, a very traditional thrash sound to it. It's not their best album, but it has some very good songs on it. But when you compare that to their 1994 album, Low, Low isn't a terrible album, but it sounds kind of different. Alex Skolnick is out of the band. They're doing other things a little bit now. Anthrax, you leave the Belladonna era with lots of classic albums, and then in 93 you get Sound of White Noise with John Bush doing vocals. He's a great singer. I love his voice, but I never felt like it meshed well with Anthrax's style. And what style were they exactly trying to play on this album? It made for just a weird sound. The most egregious example for me personally was what happened to Overkill. Overkill had done some killer albums with Years of Decay and then 1991's Horrorscope. And then it was announced, their next album was come out in early 93. I cannot tell you how excited I was for that next Overkill album. I hadn't cared for the Black Album. I did not like Countdown for Extinction. The Ritual was, kind of so-so. So I was like, okay, finally, one of my favorite thrash bands. They're going to put out an excellent album. I bought it as soon as it was released. I hear black. No, I don't hear black. I hear crap. I never liked that album. They started changing their sound on this one. It's a dull album. It's very boring. It's lifeless. After, two top-notch thrash metal classics, for them to put this album out, it really was a sign of how fast the times were changing. So yeah, metal was just undergoing a big transition in those key years, 91, 92, 93, 94. Right? Even the German thrash scene was being affected as you got there, in the early and mid 90s. Um, I can't even remember the last time I heard anybody talk about this Creator record. People love the early stuff. Even some of the albums heading into the earliest 90s still have a good following. But the stuff from the mid 90s, nobody ever brings it up. And Destruction, oh, bless your hearts. The less we say about what happened to Destruction in the mid 90s, the better. The cover there on The Least Successful Human Cannibal kind of says it all. Yeah, these bands just self-destructed and did weird things, and it wasn't thrash, and it wasn't good in a lot of cases. So yeah, metal was changing, and something else had changed even before we got into the 1990s. And this is the second big point, is that by the time you got into the early 90s, thrash was no longer the most extreme style of metal. Death metal had taken that title from them. Just a quick look here at 1989 alone. What you had released in death metal is insane. You have Morbid Angel drops Altars of Madness. You have Obituary starts puking out these indecipherable vocals on Slowly We Rot. Pestilence and Carcass are doing big things. Autopsy has what is, in my opinion, their best album come out. Bolt Thrower hits Realms of Chaos. And do not underestimate the effect that the Games Workshop tie-in had for Bolt Thrower. Tons of people in gaming subculture got exposed to death metal through that Bolt Thrower connection. And the hits just kept coming in 1990. Death was going from strength to strength to strength. Spiritual Healing comes out. Deicide debuts. I never got into Deicide myself, but they had a big impact. Cannibal Corpse hits the scene and, of course, has a huge amount of shock value with their artwork. Entombed's Left Hand Path blows the Swedish scene wide open, and you have that entire sort of slightly different flavor of death metal takes off. And yes, death metal is now the thing going forward. If you wanted to listen to the most extreme form of metal, and let's face it, that's something that's going to appeal to a lot of teenagers, well, you're going to listen to this stuff. Thrash metal has been around for several years. All of a sudden, thrash metal's, just kind of the safe stuff that your big brother listened to 5 years ago. You're not interested in that anymore. So the rise of death metal should not be underestimated. This is what the heavy metal labels were turning their attention to. This is where, Earache and Peaceville were staking their claim. Noise Records was completely oblivious to death metal. They missed the boat entirely on this. Metal Blade, took Cannibal Corpse to huge heights. While they're pushing those bands, that means they're not spending as much money promoting and hyping thrash metal bands anymore. All right. Third and last big factor I want to point out here, and what I think really did in thrash, is time was simply up. That a lot of these bands that weren't in the big four, or sort of, the next tier down, the tier two bands had been, in the system, making records, doing some tours, and they'd been doing that for several years now, and they had kind of hit their plateau. And I'm talking about bands like, Sacrifice from Canada, Hallows Eve, Intruder, the list goes on and on. Defiance is one that's often mentioned. It's one of these kind of tier two bands. Tier two doesn't mean they were bad. I like Hallows Eve a lot. I like some of Intruder's material quite a bit. But these bands had gone about as far as they were going to go. Intruder was not going to make it big with the fourth album and suddenly be on the same level as Overkill or Testament or Anthrax. All of these bands had put out multiple albums by this point. Between 1985, 1990, Intruder's got 3 albums. Same for Hallows Eve. Sacrifice, I think they squeezed out a 4th album around 93. By that point, what else were they going to do? They weren't going to get any bigger. They weren't going to suddenly make enough money off of record sales to, quit their day jobs and become rock stars. It was quite clear that they weren't going any further. And they'd already been at it for 5 years. Well, let's say that you release your first album in, 1987 or so. In 1986, you heard Rain in Blood and Master of Puppets. They changed your life, and you realized this was your destiny, was to play thrash metal and start a band. And you start it up, and you get going in 87. And by the time, 1992 rolls around, you've been slogging away at this for 5 years or so. You've got a couple of records under your belt. They've sold a few thousand units here and a few thousand units there, but you're not 17 years old anymore. When you started the band, you were in high school, you were living in your parents' house. Now you're moving into your mid-20s, and mom and dad kicked you out of the house long ago. Generation Xers, we didn't stay in our parents' houses into our 30s like millennials did. We were moved on out pretty fast once we turned 18. A lot of these folks were married. They had kids. Do you just keep trying to make yet another record that is, the potential is pretty limited for these bands at this point? The commercial side of things is focused on grunge. The metal side of things is focused on death metal. Where does thrash fit into this anymore? You weren't going to make it big. Your dreams of playing, stadiums and arenas and selling millions of records, everybody kind of woke up and realized that no, that's just not going to happen for these bands. And again, I'm not saying they're bad bands or that they were making bad records. There's only so much room at the top. You already had several thrash bands that had staked their claim as being king of the hill. You can't expand the big 4 to the big 17 or the big 28 to accommodate all these other thrash bands. There's just not enough, room in the food chain for that to happen. So these bands, their time was up anyway. And you started seeing a lot of them disappear back into the woodwork. It's time to hang up the guitar and, get a full-time job, support your family, get on with your life. Sure, some of them kept things going on the side. There's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But these couldn't be full-time endeavors for these bands that they had hit their ceiling. They weren't going to break through to that next level, and so something had to give. All right, so that is my personal hypothesis about what happened to thrash. That it's all of these factors working together. Sure, grunge wasn't helping matters anyway. It was certainly, if nothing else, a distraction to a lot of music fans. But I think it's those other things. It's, what Metallica did to heavy metal. And that was why I held such a grudge against the Black Album for so long. Not because I found it a boring album. I find lots of albums boring. But it's that it led, so many bands away from playing the styles of metal that I like, that everybody felt they had to go do the Metallica thing. It's that, you had the rise of, these other styles with Panteras and White Zombies and Biohazards. It's that death metal took that crown of, this is the new extreme stuff. Thrash, no, that's wimpy stuff compared to what we're doing. And it's the fact that these bands had grown up. They had done their time, made their records, and that was going to be their legacy. There wasn't anything more they could add to that. So, but now it's time to, first, let's keep talking metal in the comments down below. What do you think? Am I completely off base with some of these points? Have I overlooked something else that's really important in why thrash went through this significant downturn as we went through the 1990s? Have I overestimated one of these factors? Am I underplaying the importance of grunge and maybe it had more of an impact against thrash metal than I'm giving it credit for? Well, leave a comment down below and let me know what you think. All right, I think that's enough for tonight. It's about time for me to hang it up, so let's end this video. You all take care, and I'll see you again soon.